Good morning. I'm Nick Hamilton from the American Assembly, Columbia University's bipartisan think tank, where I'm the Director of Urban Policy and the Legacy Cities Partnership. It's in New York City. I would like to share with you just a few observations that are citywide to put some of our East End recommendations in context, and also to put a little bit of the Pittsburgh experience in its common shared context. Pittsburgh, like many legacy cities in the Midwest and Northeast, saw extremely rapid urbanization in the first part of the 20th century. It was a industrial powerhouse, of course, and fundamental structural changes to the global economy drove, along with public policies, drove migration both out into the suburbs and into the hotter market metros, metros in the coast and the Sun Belt. That is a history that Pittsburgh shares with the 50 other small, medium, and large-sized legacy cities around the country. Pittsburgh is not going it alone. That gives Pittsburgh an advantage because it can learn from some of the mistakes and successes that some of the peer cities have tried. Today, Pittsburgh, of course, is increasingly attractive to employers and residents. Pittsburgh is hot. There's a buzz about Pittsburgh today that is palpable around the nation. That's something to build from. It also, of course, presents a moment of opportunity to this inflection point in the economy presents now is the time to put forward certain priorities and strategies. I'd just like to point out a couple of assumptions that we are making as the ULI panel. The first one is that healthy neighborhoods are truly mixed income neighborhoods and they are racially diverse places. The second assumption that we are making is that the market can bring essential capital to these neighborhoods to pay for some of these changes, but they cannot and will not solve all of the problems. I would also like to point out that the panel provides an external point of view, and that has both benefits and drawbacks, and our recommendations and observations are informed by that external perspective. Respectfully, we submit these to you. Pittsburgh has a compelling set of strengths, and the East End has a compelling set of strengths to build from. That's a great place to start. We want to recognize some of those. The population growth of the city and metro, of course, is huge. Urban economists have indicated that scale matters. A city that is 300 or north of 300,000 people and a metro that is at over 2 million people is a much better place to build an economy around and to strengthen an economy around than a smaller city and metro. I mentioned the buzz, but there's also a pride of place that Pittsburghers have and that residents of each neighborhood have, and that is the essential building block. I also want to highlight two things Pittsburgh is very rich in: the philanthropies that exist in this city. That money and those institutions are incredible assets. Similarly, the significant globally recognized anchor institutions of your universities and hospitals are incredible assets that are part of this puzzle. Finally, I want to talk about low-cost land and low-cost and available property. Too often, we think of these things as liabilities, but we can begin to think about these things as assets that we can use in rebuilding the future. We also recognized a few challenges that are going to need to be worked through citywide that affect anything that happens in the East End. Pittsburgh, of course, made tough changes to stabilize its economy after the global economy shifted and public policies did what they did. That led, of course, to decades of infrastructure maintenance that was deferred and an underfunding of some of the local institutions that provide and facilitate community capacity. Additionally, I want to point out that the strong racial, economic, social, and geographic boundaries that divide Pittsburgh's neighborhoods are substantial when compared with certain other cities, and it's worth pointing out. And finally, I want to acknowledge the lack of the low level of immigrants and new American communities in Pittsburgh. Many cities, both hot market and cooler market cities, have found that they play an essential role, and that demographic plays an essential role in economic vitality, both at the low-income neighborhood level all the way through the very hottest transactions. There's one citywide challenge that inhibits really launching forward the rich community planning that's gone forward in the neighborhoods. As Alan mentioned earlier, it's the lack of comprehensive citywide planning, and we would really encourage you to continue this positive steps that you've made in that direction. One note on the region. The projected population growth for this region, an outside risk that the city of Pittsburgh really only has minimal control over, is will that growth be absorbed in this extreme suburban periphery where there are very few services available to future residents? Recommendations. Our citywide recommendations are that would really empower the East End neighborhoods are to conduct comprehensive planning that addresses challenges at a systems level, sets goals at multiple time horizons, the short term, the medium term, and definitely the long term. And would think about transportation and land use and other systems that transcend the neighborhoods in a global and comprehensive way. We'd encourage you to put together strong mechanisms for the formal adoption of community plans. We'd also encourage Pittsburgh to establish clear lines of authority and responsibility for citywide planning efforts. And that would require increased coordination and delineation of responsibilities between such departments as this Department of City Planning, the URA, and the several other related entities and authorities. My colleagues after me will speak a little bit more about a property tax protection program for long-term owner-occupiers. It seems like an achievable goal that would have great social benefit. And finally, I want to make one point about the role of anchor institutions and philanthropies. Anchor institutions can be used that the model as drivers of neighborhood revitalization, and other legacy cities have been successful in this regard. Pittsburgh can learn from that approach. And finally, philanthropies are in a unique position to encourage greater cooperation, coordination among community-based organizations. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Alrich.
Good morning. My name is Alrich Lynch. I'm with LDG Consulting, a consulting firm out of Atlanta, Georgia. We specialize in real estate advisory and construction management. I will be speaking on some observational challenges, but specifically in the context of the East End neighborhoods. One of the things that we recognize is that the East End neighborhoods as a broader community is a relatively newer moniker. We understand that Pittsburgh historically has had an independence for their neighborhoods and a unique identity, which we believe to be a positive asset. At the same time, we also recognize that these East End neighborhoods happen to be in the same city council district, which allows for better coordination. However, we would like to point out that there are some issues that need to be coordinated, not at the individual neighborhood level, but at the broader community level. There are several examples of that. Those range from tax delinquency, social and economic issues, crime, increased taxes, business development and growth, as well as transportation. Next, I'd like to speak to some issues of race and segregation. Pittsburgh, as we all know, continues to be one of the whitest major U.S. cities. It has one of the slowest changes of pace towards a more diverse region relative to other major U.S. cities. Institutional factors have kept to primarily keep low-income blacks in East End, whereas more moderate and higher income black residents have moved outside of the actual city limits. In addition, the inclusion of minority populations is essential for sustainable economies. We note that 13% of the population in the U.S. are minorities, but 28% of Main Street businesses are owned by minorities. Alternately, more than 40% of the Fortune 500 companies have been founded by immigrants or their children. Next, I'd like to go to economic disparities, which not only in Pittsburgh in general, but specifically in the East End neighborhood, creates an us versus them environment. Obviously, that is something that is divisive and helps to create this chasm. Secondly, we like to note that the economic disparities also depress business and entrepreneurial growth among minorities in the region, thus depressing the small business growth, which obviously is essential to sustainable economies, as just mentioned. Next, under observational challenges, we like to speak to perceptions. Specifically, just as an example, we were talking about crime in 2015 homicide statistics. The Pittsburgh and Allegheny broader region had a total of 109 homicides in 2015. The combined neighborhoods of Homewood North, Homewood South, and Homewood West had a total of 7 homicides, which works out to 6.4%. We find that to be slightly in contrast with some of the perceptions that we believe are prevalent within the areas. The next observational challenges we'll talk about is perceptions. Affordability and gentrification in 2010 to 2016. As you can see, we have a chart here. I believe it doesn't really work on the screen. However, some of the greatest increases in home values appear to be in Larimer in 149%, whereas the smallest increase in home value was in Homewood combined together at 21%. However, if you really dig down into the data and you look at it, you'll realize that all of the East End neighborhoods had sales in 2010 through 2016, other than in East Liberty, had sales of distressed and inhabitable properties, as evidenced by the extremely low values. This supports my colleagues' commentary about the significant costs associated with rehabilitation of these structures. Next, I'd like to go to the greatest increase in income in the time period from 2010 to 2014 was in Homewood West, a 53% increase. And then there was a greatest decrease in income in Lincoln, Leamington, Belmar of negative 37%. Only 3 of the 7 neighborhoods had income growth from 2010 to 2014, with East Liberty's 2014 income is the highest of all the neighborhoods, still $8,300 per year less than the average for the city. Next, we'd like to transition over to some implementation tools that we believe should be looked at across all of the neighborhoods and is not specific to any particular neighborhood. These detailed recommendations will be, for each of the neighborhoods, will follow with some of my later colleagues. The first, it will be institutionalize and codify what you actually want to happen in the broader East End neighborhoods. The first, we're just giving a sample of a few of them. The first would be move forward with the land bank. Second, create the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Third, investigate and implement some form of property tax protection for those long-term residents as well as older citizens. The next implementation tool is the HELP initiative. We believe that this initiative has some great bones and is something that will be positive for the neighborhood, but we wanted to ensure that, that it has a three-legged strategy. That includes social capital, economic opportunity, and physical improvements. Next is the creation of some redevelopment strategies. Once again, we're just going to highlight a few. We want to make sure that everyone understands where the income-restricted properties are. On the side to the right is a map of the tax credit properties within the broader Pittsburgh Allegheny area. As you can see, it's spread throughout, but there are some pockets of concentration. In addition, we understand that there is the floating of some greenway connecting neighborhoods. We speak to this in a little more detail and look at some examples in the report, one being the Atlanta Beltline that has now has a very national and prominent example of how to connect neighborhoods using green space and trails. Thirdly, we like to talk about some broader neighborhood park systems, such that these parks will not be the same type of park in each neighborhood, but will be a network of different types of parks, be it active, passive, those types of broad range that would be utilizing the assets currently available to the city. And lastly, we talk about branding of the entrances to the neighborhoods utilizing some common wayfinding elements. We believe that will help to enforce the individuality of the neighborhoods.